Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Rabbi Greg Weisman from Temple Bethel in Boca Raton. For those of you who are watching from elsewhere around the world, I am so happy tonight to be welcoming to our conversation my very good friend, my mentor, my colleague, my rabbi, Rabbi Denise Eger, who is joining us from all the way across the country in California. We have a few more people who are just making their way in. And so as they make their way in from the waiting room, I'm going to show everyone a copy of what we're here to talk about tonight, which is this fantastic volume, Mishkan Ga'ava, Where Pride Dwells, a celebration of LGBTQ, Jewish life and ritual, which is kind of a mouthful to say all at once. But we are here, of course, because in this month of June, we are celebrating Pride around the world. This past Friday, those of you who are part of our Temple Bethel community welcomed Pride Shabbat as we celebrated this past Friday. And at that service this past Friday, we read several readings and blessings from this collection. And so we thought, what better way to follow up from that wonderful service to welcome the collection's editor, Rabbi Denise Eger, to share with us a whole bunch of different things. The story of LGBTQ Jewish life, her own personal story, a little bit about how this book got put together and what it means, and most importantly, I think where we are today in terms of building a Reformed Jewish community and really a worldwide Jewish community that is a warm and safe and place where members of the LGBTQ community are not only welcomed but celebrated. So I want to begin with that celebration by saying to you, Rabbi, thank you so much for being here, and please just say a few words to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. I'm so delighted to be with the whole community tonight. It's wonderful to be back. I've had the privilege of being in Temple Bethel before, way back when at your installation. And so it's such a privilege to be with everybody. I know, 7 years already, yeah. And so I want to give a shout out to Rabbi Spitalnik Mates here and to my friend Robin Eisenberg. We're so glad to be here with all of you, and of course to celebrate this month of Pride, of LGBTQI plus Pride. And I'm going to share just a little bit for those of you that I don't know. I've been a rabbi in Los Angeles for more than 3 decades, most of that serving my congregation that I helped to found, Congregation Kolami in West Hollywood, California. The whole time of my rabbinate has really been serving within the LGBTQ community here in Los Angeles, where I'm coming to you live tonight from. But I've had the privilege of serving our movement I'm a past president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, our Reform Rabbis, one of the 3 legacy institutions of our Reform movement, as was it not only its 60th president, but the first openly gay or lesbian president. And there's been a long arc of what I would call learning within the Reformed Jewish community, and then of course the larger Jewish community, about LGBTQ plus issues and what that means, and how to go from merely tolerating to embracing. And that's really what this pinnacle ideal of what Mishkan Ga'ava, Where Pride Dwells, the book is about. You'll notice that Mishkan Ga'ava shares a name, a title, with the Reform movement's Sidurim. This book is meant to be the LGBTQ plus supplement to the Reform movement's liturgy. And so I'm going to share some screen with all of you at this moment, so that we can go into this story just a little bit more. Give me 1 minute here to help us move things better. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about Where Pride Dwells, how we got the name, a little bit about this book, which is truly a celebration of LGBTQ life and ritual. The book itself is divided into 2 parts. The first half of our book is really for individual and private prayer, private worship, and Shabbat worship and holiday worship. The second half of Mishkan Ga'ava, Where Pride Dwells, is for what we would call the LGBTQ holiday cycle. You all are familiar with the Jewish holiday cycle. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchat Torah, Hanukkah, on and on. But in the LGBTQ plus world, we have holidays as well in that community. And of course, we're experiencing one now, and that is the celebration of Pride Month and Pride celebrations. But there are others, like National Coming Out Day in October, Transgender Day of Remembrance, Lesbian Visibility Day, World AIDS Day, and even in our state in California, we have a state holiday called the Harvey Milk Day. It's on Harvey Milk, the supervisor that was a San Francisco supervisor that was assassinated his birthday is May 22nd, and they made it a state holiday dedicated to seeking equality for all. And so Mishkan Ga'ava, as Rabbi Weisman showed you the book in real, this is the cover, published by the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the publisher for our prayer books. It shares a title, Mishkan, Tabernacle, Dwelling Place, with our Siddur, Mishkan Tefillah, and the Reform Movement Machzor, High Holy Day prayer book, Mishkan HaNefesh. And so, as I said, it's meant to be the LGBTQ supplement for Reform liturgy, for Reform prayers. And this book is made up particularly of both individual prayers, communal prayers, things to use in an interfaith worship setting, but also there's some reflections and essays by famous Jewish LGBTQ people, activists and entertainers, to give a real voice. So what are we doing here in the month of June? Why are we bothering with Pride, and what does Pride represent? Well, June is the anniversary of the 3-day upheaval, riot, if you will, when the LGBTQ community said no more. The police raided the Stonewall Inn, a bar in Greenwich Village in New York City, at the end of June in 1969, 51 years ago this month. And this happened often, that gay and lesbian trans folk were harassed. Their bars were raided. They were thrown in jail. Lots of police brutality, something that relates to what, of course, we've all been seeing in the protests for Black Lives Matter today, a protest against the way police often handle situations and don't understand how to de-escalate situations. And so really the rioting that happened for 3 days at the end of June in 1969 was very much in the spirit of pushing back against police brutality. You'll see in this picture two of the key figures, if you can see, who were instrumental in that riot, frankly, against the police. The first is Sylvia Riviera, a transgender woman, and also Marsha P. Johnson here on the far right of your screen, the far left. Both were the first two to begin to fight back, and that this is how the Stonewall revolution, if you will, began. And so following that, a year later, after these days of unrest in Greenwich Village, 4 cities decided that 1 year later, they would have a commemoration of that event. And so in Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, and Chicago, each of these 4 cities mounted their own protest march to commemorate what happened in Stonewall. And so here we are. This year is the 50th anniversary of the very first Pride marches. That is why we actually decided to put together Mishkan Ga'ava. We were mindful of these 2 major anniversaries within the LGBTQ world and felt like this was the time that was ripe. Because I had served for now 32 years in this community, when I was ordained in 1988, you could not be openly gay yet and still be ordained as a rabbi or cantor. And so we were very underground and very closeted in those years, especially at Hebrew Union College and Seminary. And we actually, at the New York campus, I, and along with a couple of other students, founded an underground group called Hineni to give support to one another in a time when we lived in great fear of being kicked out of school and kicked out of seminary. Around in the 80s, or in the early 80s and into the 70s, a little bit further back, our movement was really grappling with trying to figure out what does it mean to begin to include lesbian and gay Jews back within the fold. And of course, in 1973, the first LGBT synagogue was admitted to what was then the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, Beth Chaim Chadashim. But there really wasn't the ability for gay folks to rise in leadership or to rise even unto being rabbis and cantors. And that didn't happen until 1990. And so in 1988, after I was ordained, I took the only position that was available to me, and I became the first full-time and first gay rabbi at the gay synagogue, Beth Chaim Chadashim, which was the world's first gay synagogue here in Los Angeles. And in 1990 was the Central Conference of American Rabbis was debating about whether gay people could be ordained. We needed to have a public face. And so it wasn't just a theoretical discussion, it had to be a real discussion. And there were very few people that were openly gay at that time, maybe less than 3, and only because they had been outed, not because they had come out of their own accord. And so I did an interview with the Los Angeles Times just before the convention and gave a face to the notion that there were colleagues already serving within our denomination, within our movement, and serving well, and that we shouldn't deny our movement of Reform Judaism, which had long stood for civil rights and justice, to also extend that embrace and welcome to lesbian and gay folks. And so the Reform movements had a long history of taking the steps to really bend the arc of justice towards inclusion and acceptance. So from 1990 on, there has been ability for LGBTQ people to become rabbis and cantors and of course educators. And it's been a slow but long march towards that full embrace and equality, including our movement stand to eventually bless and welcome LGBTQ people under the chuppah legally. And I had a role in helping our movement move that forward in the year 2000 by writing the resolution that gave rabbis the ability to officiate at legal weddings and ceremonies. I had the privilege myself of officiating at the very first wedding here in California. We had a marriage equality a little bit earlier than the federal. Of course, this year is 5 years since the federal courts permitted marriage equality. We're celebrating 5 years since the Obergefell decision of the United States Supreme Court. But in 2008, in June of 2008, marriage became legal in California. And I had the privilege of officiating at the first wedding for the plaintiffs on June 16th, 2008. But of course, society fought back, and the Catholic Church and the Mormon Church didn't like equality and full inclusion. And they funded a $40 million political campaign in California to reverse marriage equality. And so on November 4th of 2008, when the country was celebrating the election of the first African-American president, President Obama, the LGBTQ community in California was in tears because our right to equal marriage was taken away. And so the Reform movement was a solid and staunch ally, filed many amici briefs in that court battle to reverse Proposition 8, which we did eventually, and of course in the federal courts. We have much to be proud of in our movement. So we're just going to take a minute because it's always confusing at this time, particularly in Pride Month. What is the alphabet soup of this community and how does it come together? And so there are a lot of letters, there are a lot of abbreviations, and so we need to kind of go through them a little bit. Of course, things evolve over time and things change. When I was a younger person, we only talked about being homosexual, and that was awfully clinical. And then we began to use the word gay, and that stood for everybody, but that really wasn't descriptive of everybody. And so we added the L for lesbian for those of us who are lesbian. And then of course, bisexual people said, but what about us? We don't fit in any of those categories. So we added the B. Transgender issues are completely different in many ways, and yet is still a sexual minority. And so we've added the T. Now, the Q in the Q is because in the 90s, young people decided they didn't like the lesbian and a gay, bisexual words, and they added the word queer, a reclaiming of what used to be a slang word, and a word that was inflammatory and derogatory, and reclaiming it for a positive identity. And then there are those that don't really yet know who they are, what they are. And so the second Q is for questioning. The I is for intersex, for those that possess both male and female physical attributes. And then the A, both of the A's are for allies and asexual people. And the GNC at the end is for gender non-conforming, sometimes called non-binary, people who don't identify either as male or female. That's not transgender. That's just people living in a much more fluid identity and a fluid construct. And these are important. Why? And I think one of the things that we need to understand is when you have been excluded, when you have been marginalized, when you have been oppressed, when the Bible is often the instrument of punishment, particularly in the Christian community, but we have it in our Jewish world too, of those that point to the two only verses in Leviticus while ignoring everything else in our Torah. The people need to feel a sense of the blessing of their lives and the blessing of their identity. And so just like we say Black Lives Matter, out of recognition that the Black community, African American community has suffered greatly, and it is important to acknowledge that pain and to acknowledge the trauma and to acknowledge their individual identity. It is also important in the LGBTQ plus world to acknowledge the individual identities of queer people, of LGBTQ plus people, that we don't necessarily fit your assumption of what society said might be the way one might live her, his, or their life. I want to share with you a little bit more. We're going to look at particularly now some readings from the book, and I want to just make that segue, if you will, from this notion of lifting up people's identity, the pride and celebration of one's humanity and identity in all its forms. That is part of where pride dwells, this book is trying to also do. And there's a particular theology, if you will, a particular view of saying that your sexuality is something that God gave you and is a blessing, that we don't have to compartmentalize any parts of our identities. I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a lesbian, I'm a rabbi, I'm a friend, I'm a cousin, I'm an aunt. All of those are in me and about me. And that is true about our ways we love and places of affection. And so when we talk about our whole identity that is blessed by God, given by God, created by God, as we are created in God's image, B'Tselem Elohim, as it says in Genesis, that's something to be proud of. And that's something that is a blessing. And so in this particular prayer book, one of the ideas that we're trying to drive at is that this notion of shleimut, of completeness or wholeness, from the word shalom, shares the same root, shin lamed mem, is an important theological idea behind understanding how important our identities are and that we can weave them together in who we are as a people. And that's true whether you're gay or straight or gender non-conforming or trans. Be yourself. Love yourself. Be your whole self, just as God created you, just as God blessed you. Now, in the Mishkan Ga'ava, where pride dwells, I want to particularly share with you a couple of my favorites out of the book. In the prayer book, we actually did a call for submission, And I really want to say thank you to Rabbi Weisman. What you may not know is he actually not only contributed to the book, but he sat on the editorial committee. He had an important hand in helping shape this book and to give voice and to give birth to this book. So thank you so much, Rabbi Weisman, for your advice and your counsel and your wisdom in helping create what I think is going to be a classic for our movement, if I say so myself.
It's my joy.
One of the things that's important about the prayers and the submissions, as I said, we did this to time it between the 50th anniversary of the actual Stonewall incident and upheavals and the 50th anniversary, as we're celebrating this year, of all the Pride marches. So many of the pieces I did contribute because when I was coming up as a rabbi and serving my communities, first at Beth Chaim Chadashim for 5 years, and then at my Congregation Kolami, where Rabbi Weisman served as an intern in his rabbinical school days on staff for a couple years. We had to create, there was nothing there. We had to create ceremonies. We had to create prayers. So I had a large collection of things that I had written through the years for my own congregants, my own community, everything from commitment ceremonies, what we used to call weddings before they were legal, to prayers for pride and prayers for Passover and prayers for gender change and name changing. And yet we called for submissions from lots of other people. This particular prayer is written by Dave Yadid. He's a rabbinical student at the Jewish Theological Seminary, or the conservative movement's flagship seminary. And this is a blessing for my LGBTQ ancestors. You who fought to love, you who prayed to the same God I do, you who insisted on your dignity even when the world said you had none, you who died of AIDS while fighting for a cure so that people like me might live, you who were shot in a massacre while on the dance floor, you who could not come out and held your secret until your dying day, you who were insulted, shamed, beaten, brutalized, yet kept walking, you who contributed your fierceness, your originality, your art, your voice to this world, I walk in your memory. I walk this path smoothed and charted by your sacrifice towards justice, towards holiness, towards freedom. Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham, ve'ezrat Sarah. Blessed are you, Adonai, Sarah's helper, Abraham's shield. This beautiful prayer, kind of echoing Avot ve'imahot in our tefillah, the prayer where we call upon the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, really understands and targets the notion that gay people often are divorced in many ways from sometimes from their biological families. They are estranged. Sometimes they've been kicked out and cut off. Other times embraced. And yet there's kind of a spiritual ancestry to those who came before us, who set the table for freedom, equality, and for the ability for our queer and LGBTQ folks now to be able to live, at least in our country, in most places, in relative freedom. There's still things that we have to change and challenges that we have, but this particular prayer, I think, really speaks it in such a beautiful, beautiful way.
For those of you who were with us this past Friday night for Pride Shabbat, one of our members, Philip Altland, read that reading as we moved into the Amidah, and it created just that beautiful moment as Rabbi Eger just described.
Beautiful. But, you know, we talk about being so open and welcoming and equality. You know, there's still 23 states in the United States where you can get married on Sunday, but then get fired from your job on Monday. There are no protections nationally, federally, for workplace employment discrimination or housing discrimination for gay and lesbian folks. Of course, the Trump administration has done more to roll back equality and civil rights for LGBTQ people, including kicking transgender members of our armed forces out of the armed forces. Now they're working towards taking away giving funding to agencies federal funding to agencies and allowing them to discriminate against potential parents, LGBTQ parents, things that really are an anathema to our movement in terms of our reform movement and our reform Jewish values about loving homes and the equality and embracing that we do of LGBTQ people. And so it's not always safe for people. It isn't. And this particular prayer for safety was actually written by a 20-year-old young woman who still didn't feel like she could be publicly out. She was afraid for her family. She was afraid to put her name to something that is such a beautiful, beautiful prayer. This is a young woman who grew up in a Florida congregation. So lest you think it was from somewhere in a place like an Oklahoma or a Louisiana, let me just say it's a place right in your own backyard. God, place me in a safe environment where I do not need to fear for my safety when I am with my significant other. Help create a world where I can hold their hand, be affectionate, and love my partner without hatred, causing harm to my physical or emotional well-being. Keep me and my family and my partner safe when our existence and love is tried by those who do not accept us and our lives. Baruch atah Adonai haporei sukkot shalom aleinu ve'al kol amo Yisrael ve'al Yerushalayim. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, guardian of Israel, whose shelter of peace is spread over us, over all your people Israel, and over Jerusalem. Just a beautiful reinterpretation of the Hashkivenu prayer in a very personal way and a very, very real way. There's still much work to be done, I think, for congregations and communities to we have to continually educate everyone as they come in. People come from so many different backgrounds through our synagogues, and particularly our young people. There's always a new generation of young people who have their questions about themselves, and they need a place to be able, a safe place and safety to ask their questions and to explore their identities. And I know that happens in your congregation, Temple Beth El, and I'm appreciative of the work that you've done and will continue to do to create those places of safety. There's lots of other prayers in here. One of the things I love about Where Pride Dwells is that so many of the prayers aren't gay specific, if you will. They could be for anyone who is, in this case, a prayer for a couple before their wedding. And this one was written by our colleague Andrea Koznowski, also on our executive team that helped to shape this volume of prayers. But this prayer that she wrote for a couple before their wedding was written for two men in her congregation. And yet the sentiment in the prayer really could be read for any two people, a man and a wife, a husband and a wife that were ready to stand beneath the chuppah. Eternal God, we stand before you in our community with hands and hearts entwined. Bless them on their journey as they begin their married life together. We thank you for the opportunity to have found another soul with whom to love, cherish, and share. So you can see the words aren't LGBTQ specific, but one of the things that's been such a nice outflow from Mishkan Ga'ava is that the creativity and the understanding of ritual and the permission to create prayers and write prayers, not to deviate a little from our fixed keva tradition of prayers, that maybe will give blossom to others writing their experiences in prayers, whether you're gay or straight or trans, bi, or gender nonconforming. I do want to say that there's a lot in this book for those that are transgender and non-binary, non-gender, non-conforming as well. And there are separate and distinct issues for that community. And this particular piece is written by Dr. Joy Ladden. Dr. Ladden is a professor at Yeshiva University, the flagship Orthodox University in Manhattan. And she gave us permission. This is a prayer from her book that she wrote, a poem, but I think it's important at this time of pride to acknowledge and to celebrate the trans community and the particular trials and troubles and incredible progress that has been made for the transgender community. No matter how old you are, it helps to be young when you're coming to life, to be unfinished, a mysterious statement, a journey from star to star. So break out a box of Crayolas and draw your family looking uncomfortably away from the you've exchanged. For the mannequin they named, you should help clean up. But you're so busy being afraid to love or not, you're missing the fun of clothing yourself in the embarrassment of life. Frost your lids with midnight, lid your heart with frost, rub them all over the hormones that regulate the production of love from karmic garbage dumps. Turn yourself into the real you can only discover by being other. Voila, you're free. Learn to love the awkward silence you are going to be. I love that. To understand there is a freedom in being exactly who you are, in exactly who God made you. Um, so as I know you've already celebrated your Pride Shabbat last Friday night, but throughout the month of June, and not only in June, many communities celebrate Pride at different times of the year. But we want to make the relationship, the understanding that what we're doing when we celebrate LGBTQ plus Pride relates to understanding that oppression, wherever it is, whatever peoples are experiencing oppression, that we have an obligation to reach out and to help all march freely to that other side. And so you might notice on this particular Pride flag background, the original Pride flag had aqua and pink in it and different colors. And recently in Philadelphia, they added the brown and the black to acknowledge people of color. This was done over a year ago now. And so how timely and important that is as we continue to protest the horrid treatment of African Americans in this country and learn to understand our own racism and how that plays into all of the other oppressions, whether it's homophobia or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, and that we are called as people of faith, religious people, and we Reform Jews are religious people, to put our values into play in the world and to really heal it. And by celebrating and observing Pride Month, that's one more step toward building the world that we want and acknowledging that we can change and we can build a world filled with tikkun olam and healing. And so as I conclude, I want to just share one of my guiding lights in someone that I've looked up to. This is Bayard Rustin. You all know Dr. King. But Bayard Rustin was Dr. King's, Martin Luther King Jr.'s right-hand man. He, with A. Randolph Phillips, were the brains and the logistics behind the March on Washington, where Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Bayard Rustin was closeted, especially in those years of the early parts of the civil rights struggle. And he didn't come out publicly till much later in life. But he was in many ways the mastermind behind much of the strategy of the early civil rights movement. And so I want to close in part with his words, because I think they're timely for the times we're living in now. We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. For me, that just rings so true about the work that I've tried to do by helping push the boundaries and make a welcoming place in our Reform Jewish movement for LGBTQ people. I try to do that in my work on behalf of people with AIDS and HIV. And I think that is our call in the times that we're living in now, to be a group of people who are committed to being angelic troublemakers. And so I hope that you'll enjoy Mishkan Ga'ava, that you'll use it, continue to use it year after year at your congregation. For those of you that don't have it, it's available at this address, pride.ccarpress.org. And if you haven't bought it, it's available through June 30th with a 20% discount if you'll use the code PRIDE20. And if you prefer it in Kindle form, it's available at CCR Press as well, if you prefer Kindle to a hardcover book. Again, I'm so delighted to have been here. I know there must be maybe some questions, Rabbi Weisman, and happy to take them at this time.
And I have a ton of questions that I want to ask, and I want to invite those of you who have joined us in the Zoom room. If you have questions that you want to put in the chat, we'll be sure to raise them as well. But I want to begin with a personal question for you, Rabbi, which is, you entered the rabbinate in a time when, in many ways, the movement was nowhere, right? That the gays and lesbians and everyone else were still in the closet. And you've seen where in these now 32 years, where the movement has come and where in ways that our world has changed. And so I think I have a two-part question, which is, where did you find the courage and the strength to balance these two parts of your identity in the mid 80s, knowing that you felt called to the rabbinate, but were wondering whether or not the reform movement would welcome you in your fullness of self, and how did that buoy you through those difficult times? And could you have imagined where your career was going to take you, and where the community was going to go during the years that you have served our people so well?
Well, those are really good questions, Rabbi.
Probably well.
I guess what I think for me, there were plenty of times that I didn't think that I would be able to be a rabbi and be a lesbian. I mean, I remember getting accepted to rabbinical school and thinking, well, I'll just never be married and never have a family and never, I'll just be, I was so called to do the work of being a rabbi. I just thought that I would never have a personal life. I will say that discrimination isn't over in our own denomination in any way, shape, or form. Let us not think that we have gotten completely over the hump. Gay and lesbian and trans rabbis maybe get their first job within our movement. It's okay to be an assistant rabbi or a cantor sheni somewhere, a second cantor somewhere, but aren't too many senior rabbis of large congregations. Both women, that's an issue for women still, and certainly an issue for LGBTQ folks. So we haven't done completely what we need to do. We're working still towards that. When I took my first position after rabbinical school, when I was ordained, I went through placement, and at placement time, I was living at the time, of course, people kind of knew I was a lesbian, but again, you couldn't be ordained and be a rabbi. So we kind of kept it in the closet. I used to call it a plexiglass closet. I interviewed for jobs and really was a leading candidate on several, but on match day, got calls and said, Denise, we'd really like to hire you, but you're a lesbian and I'm not willing to take those risks. So I didn't have a job at ordination, unlike all my classmates. And finally, about a month and a half later, took the only job that was available to me, and that was to be the rabbi of Beth Chaim Chadashim in Los Angeles, the first gay synagogue, and was told at that time, Denise, you will never have another job. Don't take that. In some cases, it was kind of true, because when I left Beth Chaim Chadashim, the only job I could get was one I made for myself with 35 other people when we founded Kol Ami. And so there I've been in many ways. I think, where did I get the courage? I think courage comes in many ways. I think I had a really good teacher. I think my parents were really good teachers. They had faced some challenges in their lives and forged ahead no matter what. And they were faithful people. They were Reform Jews, but we were people that went to synagogue every Friday night. And I think their faith in Judaism and in God sustained them. And I think they transferred that to me. But I will mention my rabbi growing up, Rabbi James Wax. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. We moved there just after Dr. King was assassinated, but he played a large role in his social justice work. And he was actually the person that invited Dr. King to come to Memphis to solve a sanitation strike when the city was incalcitrant and the African-American garbage men wanted a 10-cent raise and to be able to ride in the front of the garbage truck where the white drivers were. And they weren't allowed. They had to hang off the back of the garbage trucks. And Dr. Wax, Rabbi Wax, was the president of the Ministerial Association in Memphis. And so he actually invited Dr. King, not once, but twice. And it was on the second trip for the sanitation strike in April 4th, of course, and where Dr. King was assassinated. And Rabbi Wax led a huge protest march down the main streets of Memphis to challenge the mayor the day after Dr. King was assassinated. So
Mm.
that always weighed large in my mind of what the power of being a rabbi could be and ought to be to change the status quo. And I think that I think that that's kind of influenced me too, to change the status quo when there was an injustice. And, I always say, Greg, we don't have a Jew to waste. And it seemed to me that excluding LGBTQ plus Jews who want to be part of the community was wasting Jewish lives. And we need to strengthen our Jewish community, not weaken it. And so that's always been the place from where I've come from.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. I want to remind everyone, if you have a question, to put it in the chat. But I want to ask about the book and the process. So you mentioned in your description that the timing of the book was meant to be released between the events of Stonewall in June of 1967 and gay pride marches that happened a year later. But that doesn't happen by accident, right? You didn't have this idea in 1998 and sit on it so we could celebrate the anniversary this year. So share with us why now, right? Why in this time, in moving into the middle half of the 21st century, why do we choose now to publish this book? And to really challenge you, if you think forward a generation or two, what do you hope and pray that the legacy of this book will be within the reform movement and maybe even beyond it?
Well, I think I guess for me, I've spent a lot of time working at a political level within our denomination, and of course in the larger world as an activist, a women's rights activist, and LGBTQ activist. Of course, as my service in terms of being president of the Board of Rabbis in Southern California, I was the first woman to do that, and as well as then on our CCAR to be the first openly gay person to serve as president of the more than 2,300 Reform rabbis worldwide. I think for me, this is in part kind of a culmination of a lot of the work that I've done personally through the years, but also to celebrate the creativity that LGBTQ people have brought to our movement, our denomination, and to Judaism. And to me, that was so important as part of what does it mean to truly embrace LGBTQ Jewish life, is to have this as something concrete for use by our rabbis and our synagogue. And I'll say this, every year, especially at Pride, I get a million emails. Hey, Denise, you got anything for Pride? I think I'm marching in my first Pride parade, or I've been asked on World AIDS Day, do you have anything? And so I've been kind of the resource for our colleagues through the years. I'm doing my first gay wedding. How do I do it? And so I finally said, enough. Maybe they won't have to huck me a chinik so much. If we actually had something that was a collection for that. What do I hope its legacy? I hope it will inspire people to write their own prayers, to give voice to their worries, their dreams, their hopes, and to put them in prayer form, and to see that it's not limited to what is only in our prayer book on the right-hand side of our Mishkan Tefillah pages, but to be inspired and to give voice to our contemporary situations and to give voice authentically and Jewishly to those prayers. And I'm really hopeful. And tomorrow night, I know you all have a program, but I'm beginning a conversation that's co-sponsored by the CCAR and the Human Rights Campaign at 8 Eastern. That is called, will be a conversation of interfaith conversation about queer spirituality and what does that mean. So I think that might be the next phase, Greg, of what this could mean on a larger level for LGBTQ spirituality on an interfaith level, and hope that maybe that's the next iteration here.
Do we know, are there volumes of the collections that come to us from other denominations that are similar from there? And we know that even in the last couple of years, some major denominations have faced a lot of upheaval around how they're relating to their LGBTQ plus members of their community. So is this a standalone for right now? Is this it for the religious community, or are there others?
It is it in terms of being an official prayer book. No other denomination, mainstream denomination, has an official LGBTQ supplement or prayer book. There are individual collections. My friend Chris Glosser was a candidate for ordination in the Presbyterian Church for years before, and of course they wouldn't ordain him because he was an openly gay man. He finally left the Presbyterians and was since ordained by Metropolitan Community Church. But he wrote a collection of prayers usable for his particular denomination. And there are individual collections or a prayer here. And, even the Reconstructing Judaism site has a prayer here and a prayer there, a ritual here and a ritual, but no denomination, Jewish or Christian, has its own queer prayer book, like
Wow.
the official prayer book from the denominational level. So it's pretty groundbreaking in that regard.
Very powerful, very powerful. So one of our members who's in the Zoom room with us has posted a question that I'm going to read aloud for those who are not accessing us that way. It's from Rashina Taub, and she asks, "Thank you for this generous discussion. Do you see value in sharing this book with Jewish youth? And are there other resources you can recommend as well? I am grateful," she writes.
Well, thank you, Rashina, for your great question. I do think it's important to share this book with Jewish youth. I think it could be a great lesson plan to have teens, confirmation class, to take a look at the variety of prayers, to talk about the experiences that people are reflecting in here. There's some history in this book. Harvey Milk's rabbi wrote a reflection in this book. But also Evan Wolfson, who was the attorney on the marriage equality case in the federal courts, wrote a reflection in this book about what does it mean to be Jewish and gay? And so I think those are questions that, all Jewish youth are struggling. What does it mean to be Jewish in the 21st century? What does it mean to be all of my identity? And so I think it also could be used as a way to both for youth and adults to talk about what is writing your own prayers. And here's some examples of people who wrote prayers about their experiences. How might you use our tradition to write your own prayer? So I think there are lots of applications for that. I think there's some great resources out there. I particularly like the resources of GLSEN, which is an organization who works in schools and with teachers on education issues and how to do anti-bullying work within schools in particular, and how to do positive work around people's coming out. And I think that's one of the big issues that, particularly in our synagogue setting, is to try and create safety for people to acknowledge their sexuality, to not to be afraid of sexuality, to understand that human sexuality, how we express it, gay or straight or lesbian or gender non-conforming, is really a gift from God, and to be what I call sex positive rather than sex negative. And this is something that we should be talking about with our youth and our teens, and much younger than you think. We should be talking about it with them, and we should be talking about it with adults. We don't talk about our expressions of love and sexuality. It's not polite talk. Well, that's really a holdover from Victoriana, a time that was 2 centuries ago. So we need to talk about it in loving and positive ways and have healthy conversations about ways to express our love and our affection and create family.
Beautiful. Beautiful. We have another question that I'm going to answer because it's a straightforward one. Iris Cohn asks, because she missed the beginning, she wants her transgender son to be able to watch and listen. Is this being recorded? Yes, it is. It'll be available both on the Temple's website as well as on our Temple's Facebook page. tbeboca.org is the place, Iris, where you can go. Or if you're on Facebook, you can just look up Temple Bethel at Boca Raton, and the video will be there as well.
I just want to say that there's a number of things for Iris. There's a number of prayers in here for those that are transgender, for parents. There's a number of prayers for parents of transgender folks in here, of learning of the process that transgender parents go through in terms of acceptance and love and a celebration of their transgender child. So there's a lot here in Mishkan Ga'ava, where pride dwells, for that part of our community as well.
Yeah. So I want to ask something on behalf of the congregation, because it's a thing that we have been thinking about for a while, which is that I think in many ways, as our movement has moved towards this notion of audacious hospitality, we have made a recognition that our sense of welcoming of the past was good but was not good enough. The sense of being a place where LGBTQ plus folk would feel like they can do the things they need to do in the congregation, that they're not going to be openly discriminated against, that we're certainly going to participate in same-sex marriages and even advocate on behalf of the right to same-sex marriage. But there is a way in which we can look forward. there's a way in which we can think about engaging more actively or even more audaciously to not only to signal that we are a place where there is welcome, but as you mentioned the word affirming before, I mentioned the word celebrating before, a place where part of our DNA is this is a place where LGBTQ plus folk can thrive in our congregation. And so as someone who has been leading that charge all the way through its history, through our movements, what advice could you be giving us as we have a task force of members of our community who are thinking about what could and ought we be doing, and not just today, but as we think going forward, everything from how we talk about our pronouns and how we share those, but what are some of the things that congregations around the country that may be a little more progressive in some of these issues than we in Boca Raton, or places where the deep thinking about where this conversation is going, what can you share with us maybe from the front line, so to speak?
Well, as you said, it's about celebrating and what we call embracing, right? That we're not just tolerating, but that we're embracing. And I think one of those things that we talk about has to do with the layers of education that we do. Not just putting a little rainbow banner on our website and not just saying we're inclusive, but the kinds of things you're doing now that there's regular programming that talks about these issues, not just once a year at Pride, but throughout the year, that allows to a full discussion about LGBTQ issues for those that are LGBTQ and those that are not, to educate and to learn. I think there has to be within, for example, our religious school settings, that when we're teaching, let's say, for example, about marriage, not teaching about gay marriage, but when we're teaching about marriage, that we might imagine that when the fifth graders do a mock wedding, that it might be two women under the chuppah, just as a matter of fact, that when we tell stories or read stories, we're looking at stories for even our youngest kids. There's many PJ Library books that feature, just as a matter of fact, two dads, two moms, one dad, one mom, queer kids, trans kids, that whatever the issue we're trying to teach about Shabbat, well, maybe that story should be about, Roger who became Rosie. That is how we weave it in to being part of the regular life of the community, rather than just throwing a spotlight one time a year or twice a year. And that is the real challenge. And I think the other real challenge, whenever you have a large group of people, and your temple's a beautiful, large congregation of our movement, and so diverse, is that there's always going to be need for more education. So you can't assume because you've done a program once on the basics, studying the Torah verses. Why does Reform Judaism reject the traditional interpretations of those verses that they condemning homosexuality? We have to constantly be in a process of re-educating and not assume because we've done a program once that we've solved all of the issues. So I think we have to think about that. And then we have to really take proactive stands in the public sphere. And we have to work very hard to ensure that equality for all means equality for all.
Yeah, that's especially true here in Florida. Rabbi, you mentioned a little while ago that there are certain states where you can get married on Sunday but be fired on Monday, and Florida continues to be one of those states, right? Some jurisdictions, some cities, and some counties have passed anti-discrimination laws, but the statewide, there are still a lot of things that we need to be advocating for. Fortunately, locally, most of our elected officials, our state legislators and our state senators are and some of the members of our community, member of the Reformed Jewish community, and advocate on that behalf. But it's a big state with a lot of different voices.
So how you mentioned Religious Action Center Florida. How might your congregation and your group that's committed to LGBTQ life become more involved in helping change that for the state of Florida, and link up with other organizations, Equality Florida, Human Rights Campaign, that are working in the state of Florida to help change those jurisdictions and to make that part of your agenda? That is another way to empower your congregation to work for equality and to do it, not just within the congregation, but then to extend that, the work outside.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a conversation, the pride marches that take place in many places in June don't take place in June in South Florida, because the weather is not conducive to The Pride marches are often held in the month of March, and we actually were making arrangements to march for the first time in many years this year. And of course, we all got stuck with the COVID-19 virus. We have heard that down in Wilton Manors they're planning to reschedule for December, and members of our community are have their ear to the ground to find out is there an opportunity, hopefully by then, that we can come together. And I wanted to use that as a segue to read one of the two pieces that I had written for this.
I was hoping you were going to do that, because that was how I wanted to make sure we shared them, because you wrote such a beautiful piece about our marching in a pride parade a holy moment. So would you read it for us, Greg?
So I was asked as part of the editorial process to compose what I entitled "A Prayer Before Marching for Equality." We have marched. When God called to Abraham, "Lech lecha," go forth. Abram walked to the land God showed him. When we endured the pain of enslavement in Egypt, we put one foot in front of the other. When the sea split, we marched toward freedom, celebrating with songs of joy. In Selma, we prayed with our feet. We have run in fear and dashed in triumph. We sang the words of our movement as we marched for the values we stand for. And so today we march. We march to tell the world that every human being is created b'tselem Elohim. We march to show pride in those who share the beauty and wholeness of their identities. We march to show solidarity with those whose identities are known only to themselves. We march for those in fear who cannot march. We march as allies. We march as friends. We march as family. We march as Jews. Netzeh Hasadeh, let us go forth and let our message ring out that God loves all, that we love us all, and that love conquers all.
I think we should all say a big amen to that.
Amen. Amen. There's still so much work to be done, and I want to thank you so much for your time tonight and sharing with us. I want to note that Laura, when you were talking about what we can be doing today, Laura's iPhone, I'm sure it was Laura who's carrying an iPhone, shared, I love the response, and thank you so much for this empowering input. I wanted to also add a little piece that we think about a lot, which is the size of our congregation is such that while the numbers of people in our community who identify as LGBTQ or other parts of the alphabet soup may be small in numbers in comparison to the larger congregation. But if we think about the secondary relationships, the number of parents or grandparents or siblings or cousins who have someone who identifies somewhere in this community is a lot larger than we might realize. And part of the conversations we're having as well is what can we be doing to support those in the ways that, in different generations, whether it was GLAD or PFLAG, there are wonderful opportunities who embrace everyone's relationship to this in a variety of ways, and to be a place where we can talk about and we can celebrate and we can embrace is, I think, what our goal is to be. So, Rabbi Denise, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for your love and your support and your friendship over I think it's been 9 years that we've worked together and known each other in this way.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be with your congregation again in your community, and keep up the good work that you're doing to be the welcoming, embracing place that Temple Beth El I know is.
Thank you. Thank you. So the recording of this will be available at tbeboca.org. It'll be in the list of events that have been live streamed, as well as available on our Temple's Facebook page, which is Temple Beth El of Boca Raton. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and have a wonderful night.